Yeah, I think there's actually a growing problem as the criminal justice system becomes more innovative. Because if you think about it, 20 years ago or 25 years ago, if you want to run an experiment, what you were comparing the treatment to was classic, with John Eck and I in the National Academy of Sciences, called the standard model of policing, which is pretty simple, you know? Random police patrol, response to calls for service, and not much more. Now, many cities are contaminated. By that I mean, they're doing a lot of things. How do you distinguish between what they're doing and the extra added buck you're getting out of it? Indeed, I've been trying to develop with the Inter-American Development Bank a hotspots policing experiment in South America that would randomly allocate hotspots policing, or the computer abilities and command structure for that, to jurisdictions. And it's a good place because they're not doing this stuff, you know. But I to go to South. In a sense, the fact that we're in South America suggests that it's hard to find cities in America where there's not paying attention, for example, to the geographic concentrations of crime. So all of that is true. This is true in corrections. David Wilson tells me it's hard to go to prisons and find people that don't have any treatment, etc. I mean, as things become more innovative, the question of the control group. But let me say, generally, what people do is they say the control group is the standard model in that city at the time. Right, or in that place at the time, in that prison system at the time. And the question becomes then really two separate questions. And I should note this is precisely how medicine works as well. That if there's a known treatment for heart disease that's been found to be effective, you are not allowed to put that person in a placebo control group. You can't. We have a known effective treatment. So the treatment you give becomes a comparison to the present treatment. And the way you work with that is that if the treatment is not significantly different, either positive or negative, from the current treatment. So in our case, it would be whatever the normal New York City police situation is with a hotspots policing, let's say, legitimacy-oriented program. You'd compare it, and if it's not significantly different, you'd say, well, both of these are about the same. That's not completely true statistically, but in any event, if the experiment is strong enough, and you would come up with a outcome that you'd say, well, which one is more cost efficient? And you might choose that one. You could choose both. If it's more effective, of course, you come to the conclusion it's more effective. Yeah, I guess that's a long-winded way of saying the control group is a big problem that has to be solved. What you have to try to do as much as possible is prevent additional contamination. You can't take a hotspot of crime and remove all police service. You can't take a hotspot of crime, find out what general police service is, decide what that is, and then create a routine for preventing contamination of that. That you can do.
Yeah.
Okay. We have Nancy.
And there's a question. She had her hand up in the corner as well.
Okay.
Okay, so I had two questions. First, crime is down across the country and in many countries around the world. And it seems to me that both your models ignore the mystery question of what's causing that drop. Am I right or wrong about that? And then the second is, it does seem that I heard a very, very narrow and worrisome articulation of what the cost of this are. We really do, in fact, the second speaker said that it's not very expensive. And what I think you missed there, I've been on panels with police officers from 100 Blacks in law enforcement who care, and also Latino police officers who have said the costs are enormous. They include those people who are arrested and given summonses. These are tickets, missed work, missed school, lost job, lost employment, huge economic consequences to these disadvantaged neighborhoods, far beyond just legitimacy, not that I'm dissing legitimacy, but there are substantial externalized economic costs, which I don't think you can disregard in the way that you have, and coming from communities that are least able to afford and absorb those costs.
Well,
Yeah,
let me address the crime trends one, and then, David, you should address the tough question.
Okay.
Yeah, you're right. Crime is down. It's somewhat uneven across the United States, but the general pattern in the United States, and indeed this does apply throughout Western Europe, Australia, throughout the so-called developed world. Early to mid-90s, crime rates began to come down. By the turn of the century, in most places, not just in the U.S., they flattened out a bit, and after a few years, they've begun to come down again. The irony there is that they came down during the second worst economic downturn in over a century. So, what caused crime to come down over that long period of time? You ask, an important question. There is no single answer. Al Bloomstein and Joel Wallman have a wonderful book called it's another book. The Crime Drop in America, in which several experts weigh in. Frank Zimring's Great American Crime Decline. There are a lot of people who've tried to tackle it. I have in my own work. Some combination of the aging of the population, clearly, especially in the more recent years, economic changes, but operating not always in the way that may seem most obvious. My own view is that we could have a whole other discussion about mass incarceration. Mass incarceration at its peak was reducing crime, also producing lots and lots of injustice and other collateral consequences, but was reducing crime. Now, mass incarceration doesn't apply elsewhere. Economic change and the aging of the population does. And with that population aging has come some cultural shifts that may well also have contributed to the crime decline. But these questions have been addressed through research. I don't think there are definitive answers yet. We worry or wonder about the crime decline in New York City. I'll just finish with this. It's clear we've focused on policing, and it's Bill Bratton who got all of us thinking that policing can reduce crime. That it seems matter of fact now, but it was in the 1990s when Bratton effected that revolution in our thinking. David Bailey, as Tom Tyler mentioned earlier, David Bailey typified the traditional thinking, which was the police don't reduce crime. Crime's caused by all kinds of things. The police don't have any effect over those things. All the police can do is respond to crime and capture wrongdoers, right? That thinking has changed. I'm convinced the police do contribute to crime reduction. How much is obviously an open question. I think we should think about the police in their relationship to crime the way we think about physicians and hospitals and their relationship to much disease, right? Any sensible person knows that a physician and a good hospital can not only help to manage, but also reduce the incidence of certain kinds of diseases. And any sensible observer knows that physicians and hospitals do not have control over all the conditions that generate disease. A disease, for example, like diabetes, where we know that there are environmental causes over which physicians have very little effect. I think that's the proper way of thinking about how the police relate to crime reduction, as a physician and a hospital might to disease. Now, on the other question, David, I'm sure, has a good answer for that.
Yeah, let me.
Your models don't essentially take correlation. They stop questioning risk, associated with violent felony. You don't like discount or plus there are fewer violent felonies every state,
Well, I have done those kinds of studies. In fact, most of my career has been devoted to those kinds of studies. It's only been relatively late in life that I've done studies that focus so much more squarely on the policing element. But you make a good point that there are many, many other things involved, and we are not necessarily, in the best way we might, comparing the policing effect with the effect of some of these other influences. In our study, we do try to statistically control for other influences operating at the neighborhood level, like the level of immigration, the level of economic disadvantage. They all do make a difference, by the way. And we're trying to statistically isolate the effect of policing, and this single policing strategy at that, from those other influences.
Yeah, trying to deal with long-term crime trends, I suggest you speak to Eric Baumer, who's sitting at the front table here, because he, sitting right there, because this is something he's done a lot of work on. I think is really interesting, and I think it would be useful. What I'd say, let me just say something about the effects of policing. I mean, the revolution, if you like, that changed what David Bailey had to say, had to do with a series of randomized trials, really, that showed that you can have an effect on crime if you focused in on some places and not on others. And I've done some of those. Larry Sherman has done others, and a group of other people. So it wasn't the crime trend analysis that led to that. At the same time, you should note, Bill Bratton was taking credit for the 50% decline in homicide and stuff like that. It's very hard in these large area trends. By the way, lead poisoning now is lead in the atmosphere is now considered. People have a strong theory about that as well. And it's all problematic because we're talking about the same set of data. It's hard to disentangle it. About the issue of cost, what I meant, and I'm going to be more careful about this in the future because I think both you and Dolores have raised really important ideas. What I meant was that it's not very hard for the police to do one stop, question, and frisk. And one year they did 800,000 at a time when the number of police had declined like 12%. So yeah, that's what I meant by, I was really talking about expense of the police. In terms of its costs in some sense, yeah. Dolores, you gave a series of things. I wrote them all down, I'll have you note, and I just took notes on these. Yeah, there are all sorts of, David Kennedy, by the way, I don't know if you've heard David Kennedy in this, he says, my God, the police are committing crime. I mean, one cost is the police commit crimes all of a sudden. So, because he says it's so clear in many cases is not constitutional. But in any event, yeah, just to say that I was talking about, how hard it was to bring one of these things, and it's not hard. In fact, that may be why it was so attractive to the police at the time. And just to give a sense, at least if you read Kelly's statements on this issue, you get the sense that he was concerned with the decline in the number of police in New York. I don't remember exactly, it was 12 or 15% during the period. So he was declined, and he was looking around for some way to get the same amount of policing with a 15% decline in the number of police. And he hit upon this idea of throwing new recruits, Operation Impact, into these areas. So in his mind, at least, he was sort of following through on a deterrence idea, a theory at least, that he had about crime that now has come under increasing attack.
Okay, we've got Nancy and then Dolores, and then we'll go to the back for 2 questions.
All right, thanks. I certainly support the idea of experimental design in theory. I'm still not convinced that there's a way to do it. I say that because I can't imagine finding any law enforcement agency that is willing to compare business as usual to intensive stop, question, and frisk. Right, we know that. We know that in part because I tried to do it a few years ago and couldn't find any agencies that were willing to go there. So I think the alternative is business as usual, whatever that looks like. I do think a focus on hotspots is the way to go versus what does best practice look like in terms of police interacting with citizens when you know that some aspect of that interaction is going to involve a stop, a question, and perhaps a frisk under the right legal circumstances. So we've been giving a lot of thought to this at the Urban Institute. We have a book coming out on it any day now, supposedly, although it's bouncing around like the political football it is all throughout DOJ. Everybody wants one more review of it. It's funded by the COPS office. And my challenge is this. In our opinion, best practice...
What's the book, Nancy?
It is on stop and frisk.
Oh, it is.
But it's not any kind of research on impact. It's more if police are going to engage in this practice, and they do to some extent, whether intensive or not, what are the best practices? What do we know about community policing that could help inform that? And where we come down on that is that it's got to be both a top-down and a bottom-up approach. So the top-down approach is the executive communicating what respectful interaction with citizens look like. It's the agency and the executive communicating with residents in high-crime areas about why there's more intense police presence in those areas and what it means when they do stop pedestrians. And it's also about building accountability measures that law enforcement officers would use through reporting. It's certainly training the officers, selling the stop, as they call it. A lot of us know a lot of the best practices already. And the challenge I have is how can you do that experimentally without contamination? I mean, you're bound to have that if you do it right. If you have the top-down and the bottom-up approach, you're talking about an agency-wide intervention, and I don't really see how you can do that with an experimental design, and yet I think it does merit investigation.
Yeah, I don't know. First of all, I think there is an experiment on stop, question, frisk. I think Anthony Braga, I think, was doing it. Bob, do you know about that? There's something going on, or maybe was it Ed Davis that agreed to it and then stepped down as police commissioner? I assume there's no causal relationship. But I think first of all, let's distinguish a number of different things. One of the problems is that at some point you've got to say there's just a lot of illegitimacy. A police department that does 800,000 frisks in a year. By the way, in Hong Kong, they did 1.5 million or something last year. Just so you know, interesting enough, I heard from a reporter in Hong Kong who interviewed me. But to some degree, stop, question, frisk is carried out. Terry stops were meant to have had a purpose. They weren't supposed to be what they've been used for, it seems to me. They weren't supposed to be some general deterrent strategy. They were supposed to be an approach that the police could use when they had real, reasonable suspicion of a crime being committed. Now, what's interesting about this is when New York City goes down to 100,000 or 200,000 stop, question, frisk, they're still only arresting 5% of the people. Now, that I find personally extraordinarily interesting, and that provides the possibility for an experiment. In other words, even when New York City goes down to a level, and maybe they'll get even lower, of let's call it the level that Terry stops should be used, in 95% of them, they don't lead to anything. So you could imagine an experiment in which you would identify hotspots of crime and use that low standard, if you like, in one group and then have none in the other group. Can you have none? Seattle Police Department at the moment has basically said no SQF, period. No consensual SQF, no other SQF. So, yeah, I think there's ways of manipulating this, and this is always a problem. When you want to experiment, you can't get a gain without some pain. When you want to experiment, you have to have some pain. And that pain is about constraining the way you can behave in the real world. But the benefit of it, of course, is learning something very important about both the negative and positive effects of an intervention. So I don't agree. I think it's hard. It's always hard. When I did the Minneapolis Hotspots experiment with Larry, people said, you can't randomly allocate the entire police force of a city. Are you out of your mind? Right? And we did it. And now a couple of people have done that kind of thing.
What the treatment is. I mean, I would argue that treatment is best practice. And if that's the case, then I don't know how you do that.
If the treatment is best practice, you mean the existing best practice in an agency?
No, the best practice as embodied in the Urban Institute report that's coming out soon, as embodied in...
You take best practice, you go to departments that haven't implemented those best practices, and you could do that. You're right. If an agency has already implemented all these practices, you can't experiment.
At the reception after this. Yes.
So what, and Jim Lynch knows this because we've had this conversation a few years ago. So what I still find very disturbing about the suggestion that we experiment with a practice that has such a high level of false positives.
No one has said here to experiment with SQ. By the way, I will say right now that I have not advocated experimenting with SQFs. I don't want to experiment with SQFs. I think SQFs in the policy in New York is extremely problematic. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about experimenting with a hotspots policing strategy that uses legitimacy evaluations as a key issue. Because essentially that is, in my view, the deterrent effect of SQFs. You're hardly getting any benefit, if you ask me, I don't know that empirically, from by the way, David Greenberg suggested this as a strategy, looking at the distribution for cases where SQFs led to an arrest and didn't lead to an arrest, and I suspect those distributions are not very different. But anyway, go ahead.
Okay, so the one question, and that you may be able to answer, well, for both of you, because it sounds like it's possible to do hotspots policing without utilizing stop, question, and frisk, and I would put forth that would probably be a really good thing because of the high level of false positives when the police do use SQF. My other question is, we focused a great deal today on sort of quantitative analysis, but we know that there is a substantial body of qualitative research that says, since we've been using the medical model, right, it says, most of all, do no harm, but that there's a great deal of harm, and we've touched on it back and forth during the day, that comes out of aggressive stop and frisk that we know empirically provides very little accuracy in terms of crime detection. And I would like to have you both sort of respond to that notion that Terry never authorized deterrence. It authorized an opportunity to detect crime at a lower level of probability than a higher level one. And so the notion that people, and in New York, those people mostly be back in black and brown, would be sort of treated as guinea pigs, so to speak, is, sort of offensive on all kinds of really interesting ethical and moral levels. And so now that I heard David say that the experimentation piece is not about using SQF, and then listening to Nancy talk about best practices, and the question always comes up, best in whose determination, right? Because one of the issues that really is the elephant in the room is that this conversation is taking place in a room full of people who are primarily not affected by this practice, particularly in terms of our males of color. They're not among our researchers, they're not among our discussants. And so that if we were going to talk about best practices for research, shouldn't we be combining qualitative and quantitative methodologies to get a better handle on our guesses that we're making about whether or not there is any deterrent effect, which again, I'm not conceding that it's a legitimate legal basis for the use of stop and frisk at all. So I know I asked a lot of stuff.
Yeah, just to deal with a couple of them. You're right, Terry has been carried a long way from its original legal purpose. For better or worse, and I think obviously we've been talking and lots of the discussion is about some of the negative consequences of that, but frankly, I have to tell you that the degree to which the Terry decision has been interpreted as enabling deterrence to occur, that strikes me in and of itself as a good thing. Not when it's practiced in such a way that it constitutes mass surveillance and I think the term is probably accurate, social control of disadvantaged young men. But I am interested in knowing what police practices are most likely to deter or avert crime. Every time, I mean, this is Criminology 101, but it's so important. Every time a crime is averted, that young person who might have committed that crime is not going to run all the risks associated with crime commission, plus all the risks associated with getting caught and the arrest process, the judicial process, the stigma, and all the rest. So averting crime, deterring crime, is all to the good as far as I'm concerned, but it has to be done equitably without bias. No, David is right, and I hope I never was taken as suggesting that the experimentation should be an experimentation of stop, question, and frisk as an abusive tactic compared with stop, question, and frisk as a less abusive tactic or anything of the sort. Abusive police tactics are not to be experimented with as far as I'm concerned because we have no interest in implementing them. We want to curtail them. But there's lots of room for experiment. David is talking about experimentation primarily in terms of looking at the legitimacy question, which I think is quite important. There's plenty of room for experimentation just to find out among all the different things that the police do, which of those things is more effective in reducing crimes of particular types. And Nancy, I think those experiments can be carried out. We did carry one out in St. Louis. You're right in the sense you can't stop the contamination that, quote unquote, that comes from the police necessarily having to do policing while they're part of an experiment, right? They still have to engage in something they recognize as policing. But you can introduce systematic variation in those activities, and the nice thing about an experiment, you can do that through randomization. So a far cry from the struggles that and all of us have to deal with when we deal with observational data. Much better, much stronger basis for causal claims, far from perfect.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting, my work on the concentration of crime in hotspots and the way in which police can interrupt that and stuff like that has become I hear it's very popular, I might say, and a lot of funding has been invested more recently in these sorts of questions. And at the same time that happened, typically of me, I went off in a slightly different direction. If you look at my book, The Criminology of Place, it's looking at structural features of places, collective efficacy, informal social controls, and things like that, and what their relationship is to crime hotspots. And as you might expect, they're strongly related. So lately I've been trying to get people interested in what I call social interventions. Non-enforcement related interventions, community rather than the police taking a leadership role in crime prevention. We have a project in Seattle, which the community is the leader of crime prevention. The police are only like extras along the way. We have a project in a randomized experiment actually going on, which will start soon in Brooklyn Park, Minnesota, in which you are randomly allocating hotspots, and then the police are developing a project to try to increase the collective efficacy of people who live in those hotspots. So I think there's lots of room to look at these sort of interventions in combination. One of the problems here is you can send community members onto a street, and like one of the things we're doing is people from the community center and the schools, they go on the street and they talk to the kids and stuff like that. But to some extent, if someone pulls out a gun, you need the police. So police have an important function. Law enforcement has an important function. By the way, a Terry stop has a function within a reasonable set of parameters, right? Yeah, I think there's a good deal to do here that could examine many of these sorts of issues, and I think you're absolutely right. I'm very interested in the intersection between qualitative and quantitative work, so we can understand the mechanisms underlying what's happening. An experiment tells you, I gave you aspirin, you got better. Now the question is, what is going on that aspirin made you better? So, yeah, I think you're absolutely right about those issues, and I think the issue you raised about the cost. Yeah, the cost, if you could send me some stuff on that, I'd really like it. It's to reinforce that point. Thank you.
Okay, we have 2 more questions and then we'll wrap up.
Okay, so I admittedly have a lot that I need to digest. I work with young people who mostly come from Harlem and Washington Heights. So a lot of what we do, is use research similar to what you've talked about, also with testimonies directly from the young people and in our neighborhood to develop our strategy. So my question is going to be more based on that. We have a situation where, the majority of our young people have not just been stopped, but have been stopped several times, right? So there's the impact that stop and frisk has on crime, but also, also part of our concern is what is the impact of stop and frisk on their mental state, right? Myself, I've lived in an over-policed community for 30 years, and there's still information that I'm looking for on that. But one of the things that I've been really interested in is what we're talking about, or there was different references to experimental research, right? We have a situation now where we have a commissioner who talks a lot about collaborative policing. But I haven't heard a lot of examples around how do you take in data that uses, saying information that you're getting from the police department as well as information that you're getting directly from the people who live in these communities, right? So the only experience I've had with that is in some type of participatory research. So one of the questions I wanted to ask is, moving forward, is there some type of way that you can see that approach being worked into some of these experimental research studies? So I guess using the example, right, you have people who are coming into hospitals and you're counting that, but you also need to do some type of evaluation of what is the service that they're receiving in the hospital, and has that been effective? And on our side, at least the people who are doing the work on the ground, that's something that we see as being valuable as well. So it's just something that I wanted to ask.
Yeah, maybe I'll start. It's a little off your question in a way, but as you were talking, it reminded me of something that helps illustrate the point that I was thinking about. That, I said before there's lawful but awful policing. So let me give you an example from your example. There's a Campbell review out that says that criminal justice processing and law enforcement approaches with juveniles backfires. In other words, forgetting what happens when they're 25 years old, you take a 16, 17, 8-year-old kid, throw them in the criminal justice system in any form, in any way, it's bad. The outcomes are bad. They're worse than if you never did anything, didn't go near them. So there's a lot of good evidence that police should not be using their law enforcement powers if they can avoid it with younger people. It's going to have a backfire effect. Now we take stop, question, and frisk in New York. What do? This is mostly focused on younger people. So, yeah, I call this lawful but awful policing if it was lawful. In other words, I can imagine Commissioner Kelly going, 800,000 is not lawful, we're going to create all these criteria. And if he would have worked with the Justice Department, they would have written up some legal thing of when you can do a Terry stop, and you'd be surprised. You can do a Terry stop quite a few times in a city like New York. And I would have said, that's lawful, but it's awful, because that's not going to lead to the outcomes you want. So all this stuff needs to be thought through. I think Bill Bratton is someone who has been around a while and has learned a lot since he was commissioner of New York last time, about the importance of legitimacy, about working with the community, about the importance of research and experimentation, right? Now, the realities of a place like New York, where every time you breathe, the New York Times, the Post, everything here is world news the moment you turn around. It makes it very hard. But I would suspect that what you're thinking about, I would say to trust the commissioner at the outset. I think he really means that stuff. I think that Bill Bratton has New York City has brought on board someone that has sort of the whole turn of experience, from creating CompStat to going to LA and dealing with a consent decree, right, and working with that consent decree in a very successful way, which involved dealing with the communities, et cetera, much more than he ever did in New York. I think, and he sat on the Harvard executive session for 3 years, came to most of the meetings. I think Bill Bratton, when he says things like, this community engagement, I think it's something he's learned along the way. And I think he's a very effective guy. So that doesn't answer your question completely, but I think you should look to the police department, give it a chance with Bill Bratton, and see what you can do with them. And let's see whether Bill is going to do something really interesting this time.
Let me just briefly address the issue of participatory research, which you brought up, and it harkens back to Dolores's point about not using black and brown people as guinea pigs. I think that's really essential for this kind of research and for the best kind of experimental research. It is related to the so-called problem-solving strategy, which in principle means the police engage with people in the community to identify problems, but also elicit from community members their sense of what the police ought to be doing to solve those problems. Community members may have a sense of whether the police should be spending more time in the alleyways and less time on the main thoroughfares, more time checking building locks and window locks, and less time stopping occupied vehicles, right? It's a two-way engagement. The police may disagree, but it is engagement, and that strikes me as precisely the way you carry out real experimentation, treating people with dignity and not as guinea pigs.
We have one final question in the back.
Hi, I'm going to stand because I'm tiny. I just wanted to respond and then sort of ask a question related to Professor Weisbird's response earlier to Professor Jones-Brown about why that the research is just about proving whether or not something is effective, and why is there such pushback about whether or not it's a good policy? Why is there such pushback about making something, testing whether something is effective or not? And I wanted to say, so it was interesting to hear your story about going through the airport and you saying that you felt that you were sort of frustrated at having to go through that process. And one of the reasons that you gave, more or less, was that if the officers were if the officers were doing a better job at profiling, of using profiles, that you wouldn't have been harassed as much. In some sense,
okay, go ahead.
In some sense, it sort of came off as they should have racial profiled, or they should have profiled based on age, or that sort of thing. I think for me, I can't speak for anybody else, but I think for me, it's hard to absorb research when it's coming from mouths that feel so tone deaf to what's happening on the ground. And I think for me, I don't know if any of you really addressed Julian's question. I would really love to know more about it. I would like to know more about what you guys are doing to sort of connect with communities and listen to people's stories who are actually impacted, and how much that in the future will sort of come to bear on your research. Because I think that people who are more connected really ask different questions and approach things differently. And I think Julian suggested participatory research as one option, but I would love to hear how you guys are exploring that and including community voices, whether it's qualitative research or sort of vetting your own quantitative research in your processes.
Yeah, I should tell that story in a bit more detail because it's kind of funny. because I was working with the airport authority on security in Israel. And I told them, I said, stop. When you want to stop people, stop groups of people. Don't make people feel like they're singled out, right? In other words, it looks like you're profiling, people feel they're being laid out. So after I told them that, the next time I went to the airport, I got stopped. And maybe because I was thinking it. I told them to stop. People can't feel that they're being profiled. But look, I am not arguing for profiling. Profiling is a very complicated issue. I don't want to really get into it, because arguing that there should be no profile in the world of security, et cetera, is also maybe have its consequences. But please don't think that I was saying that we should be stopping young black males on streets. My God, that's not what I'm saying. Okay? Now, your question about, I was asked to look at a certain problem and use the best skills I had to look at that particular question. I wasn't asked to look at legitimacy questions. I wasn't asked to look at other questions. Maybe the Soros Open Societies Foundation should have thought more about this at the very beginning, but that's how I was approached, if you like. That's what people came to me with. You're clearly right. You can't be totally, in research, you can't separate yourself out from the realities. I mean, David Greenberg, I think it was said to me before, there was a song you wouldn't know. It was in the 1960s by a guy who did these kind of folk songs that were meant to be cutting, and Werner von Braun was a scientist who from Germany, and he invented the missile program in Germany. He's one of the greatest missile developers in the 20th century. And he was German, and right after the war, the American CIA picked him up before anyone else could and took him to the United States, and that's why we got to the moon. Because Werner von Braun was the head of the missile program in the US. And this guy wrote a song in which he said, one of the verses was, I don't care, what?
My rocket goes up, my
rocket goes down.
It's not my responsibility, says Werner von Braun.
It's not my responsibility, says Werner von Braun. So it was Tom Lehrer. So it is your responsibility, because your conclusions might lead to very negative things happening. For example, a conclusion that stop, question, frisk has a deterrent effect could lead the New York City police to say, hey, let's do more of these. And I don't think that's the solution. And indeed, when I first wrote about the hotspots nature of stop, question, and frisk, the mayor's office called me, and they thought I was going to be a great defender of theirs, and they were very disappointed after our conversation got increased. But yeah, I understand what you mean, but the other side of the coin is, if you want to ask me the question, does SQF have a deterrent effect? This is the best answer I can give you. And I tried very hard, and Rick did too as well, to say that doesn't mean it's a good thing. That doesn't mean you should be doing it. But I'm not going to give you the wrong answer because of that, right? I should give you the answer as best I can. And those other issues are really important. And I think a number of people are studying it, Jeff Fagan, Tom Tyler, et cetera. Dolores, it sounds like, as well. Yeah, maybe this game is over in a way, because the commissioner says that he's not going to allow this anymore to be used as a general strategy. So maybe that's better. But maybe there's something else as well along the way. Anyway, that's a long-winded way of saying that I think you're absolutely right, but you also have to have some dispassionate approach as well.
I want to make a comment about your question, how much time do we spend listening to voices in the community? As much as possible, actually, but I have to say not as much as I'm sure you would like, but as much as possible, and much more at this point in my career than earlier on. But I'll tell you, in my community, the voices and I try to listen to a representative sample of voices, most of the voices in my community are wondering how to bring down crime, predatory street crime, not computer crime, not terrorism, but the kind of crime that makes people's lives utterly miserable day in, day out, and worse, right? That's also a community voice. And if there are police strategies and tactics that can reduce crime without abusing the rights of citizens, then I'm all for them, and that's why I'm motivated to do this kind of research. So yeah, it's very much having to do with listening to voices in the community.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the presenters. I'm going to ask Rick to say, I'm going to ask Rick to say a couple of closing words for the symposium, and then we'll go ahead and head over to the reception.
Very brief, because we have a wonderful reception to go to. I just want to thank my partners, Karen Terry and Preeti Chauhan. And although he hates to be mentioned by name, so I won't. And our partner at the Open Society Foundations. It has just been an utter joy working with these people, and I hope, and not to mention, David Weisbord and I have become friends over the last few years in struggling, and David's colleagues, and my friend Robert Fernango. I mean, one of the joys of research, and if there are any students left here, one of the joys of research is that it is a collective enterprise when it's done right. And this place, John Jay, is an exciting place to do research. They know how to convene research. They know how to direct researchers to important problems. They know how to bring people together who are not going to give you an easy time, but are going to ask really tough questions. I appreciate that. So thank you for coming. We are going to continue with this work, and I hope you will continue with your spirited commentary on this kind of work. And so now let's go eat and drink.
Yes. And the reception is in the adjacent building. So you'll go down to the lobby here and then walk straight across the lobby and go up to the 6th floor in the adjacent building. We'll have a number of volunteers that are leading the way, so please do join us. Thank you.